We often think of public policies as the end result of coalition building. A political party mobilizes, it brings together like-minded interests, and cooperatively these affiliated groups push through a policy agenda that reflects their concerns. However, policies also create politics. That is, they mobilize new groups, they divide old coalitions, and they bring together former competitors. This process is evident in the rise and the fading of the New Deal Democratic Party and the changes that brought to public policy. So let's start first with the 1928 election, and we can talk about how different public policies grew out of different coalitional groups, and then in turn how policies that were created then split or brought together these different types of groups. As you can see from the map, in 1928, the South, especially the Deep South, was solidly and strongly Democratic. The Republican and Democratic parties were more competitive in the North. In 1932, you have a realigning election that makes the Democratic Party the dominant political party, primarily by gaining strength in the North and in the Midwest, especially in industrialized cities. And of course, it maintains its support and even strengthens throughout the South. As a result, though the dominant party, the Democrats, in 1932 were comprised of two regionally and very ideologically distinct groups. There was the one party South, which was comprised of white conservative voters. Blacks were disenfranchised. In the North and in parts of the Midwest, the party's strength was among labor unions, Catholics, white ethnic voters, and some remnants of the progressive movement. This northern progressive wing of the party favored greater government regulation of the economy, labor rights, and the provision of a social safety net. Policy goals that members of the southern wing of the party opposed because they recognized that these policies posed threats to the prevailing pattern of white racial dominance. Now, this kind of ideological and regional split is reflected in the social welfare legislation that Congress passes during this time period at the urging of President Franklin Roosevelt. In 1935, Congress enacts the landmark Social Security Act. This act institutionalized the federal government's role in providing economic security and poverty assistance. However, Southern conservatives in Congress feared that greater federal intervention would weaken white control of blacks, and they controlled very powerful positions in Congress, and they used those positions to try to limit the reach of that law to African Americans. So, for example, during the first 15 years of Social Security, retirement benefits were not available to domestic workers or agricultural workers, and these were occupations that employed most African Americans, primarily in the South. Similarly, states retained a great deal of discretion when it came to the administration of public assistance programs for the elderly poor and for impoverished families. And in many southern localities, officials used that discretion specifically to exclude African Americans. As you can see from the map of the African American population in 1932 and 1936, most of the African Americans during this time period live in the South. There is some smattering in northern cities, but because of the fact that African Americans are concentrated in the South, working primarily in positions that are not eligible for Social Security benefits, during that time period, very few blacks qualified for either Social Security or public assistance. They're completely locked out from Social Security. During the post-World War II years, social policy reflected this strange mix of Democratic dominance in the White House, but very strong conservative centers of power within Congress. For many years in Congress, you had the Conservative Coalition. This was an alliance of Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats who came together to limit liberals' efforts to enact national health care, expand Social Security, or pass reforms that would have guaranteed full employment and strengthened labor unions. However, you begin to see some change in the 1940s. The maps show in dark blue in the South where the Democrats are strongest, and some of these patches are fading, signifying the shrinking share of votes won by Democrats. Because of these momentous changes associated with the civil rights movement, by the 1960s, the South is no longer exclusively a one-party region, and African Americans become an important part of the Democratic coalition, both in the South and in many northern cities where blacks migrated in the years after World War II. So what's going on during this time period? Well, from 1948 onward, the Civil Rights Movement begins a slow realignment of the South from the Democratic to the Republican Party, and this marks the end of the New Deal coalition. It's easier to see this switch if we take a look at a map that shows the votes for Democrats and Republicans and third parties simultaneously. Now on this map you can see the rise of yellow in the South. That's the Dixiecrat Party. In 1948, many Southern conservatives were angered by President Harry Truman's decision to integrate the armed forces, and they came together under the banner of the under the States' Rights Democratic Party, that is also called the Dixiecrat Party, and they supported Strom Thurmond's third party candidacy. The Republican Party during this time period is also beginning to shift towards the right as a result of a resurgent conservative movement, and it begins to gain ground in the South, which you see on the map as red. In 1964, Barry Goldwater carried the Deep South despite losing in a landslide nationwide election to Lyndon Johnson. Meanwhile, Democrats remain strongest in the North and in Midwestern cities with large African American and white ethnic preferences. As the South begins to move away from the Democratic Party, the party also becomes much more liberal because it's losing its conservative wing. With the party more liberal, it's easier for President Lyndon Johnson to push through Congress plans for a greatly expanded social welfare policy agenda. So in 1964 and 1965, he pushes through the Great Society and the War on Poverty. Congress enacts Medicare and Medicaid. It increases funding for programs to revitalize urban areas. It expands legal counsel for the poor and provides greater access for the poor to education, healthcare, housing, job training, and nutrition assistance. At the same time, as the Democratic Party becomes more liberal, it also becomes much more divided. The Vietnam War, the war on poverty, and the growing militancy of the civil rights movement helped to alienate some of the more moderate members of the party, particularly the white, ethnic, and Catholic voters. As a result, the party's hold among white Southerners and white ethnics dissipates. On this map, you can see Republicans in red gaining strength in urban areas of the Midwest, and George Wallace's third party candidacy in yellow carrying the South. The realignment of the South away from the Democrats and towards Republicans in presidential elections heralds a rightward national shift in policy. As the Democratic Party becomes more liberal, it also becomes much more competitive with the Republican Party. So in 1972, Richard Nixon is able to convert many of the Wallace voters into Republican voters, and he wins that election. Jimmy Carter in 1976 was the last Democratic presidential candidate to solidly carry the South, but he did that by running as a moderate from Georgia, and he was also helped by the fallout of the Watergate scandal. By 1980, the trends simply continue, with Ronald Reagan doing very well in the South and in other parts of the country in 1980, and then again in 1984. Republican candidates for the White House, especially Reagan, do very well campaigning on a platform of tax cuts, law and order, less government regulation of business, and tougher restrictions on welfare for people who are poor. And all of this appeals very much to working class white voters that used to be a stronghold among Democrats. Reagan, during this time, also instituted structural budget deficits that would hamstring Democrats' abilities to reverse some of the spending cuts he pushed through, even when they do manage to regain the presidency during the 1990s. If you take a look at the map, you'll see that by this point, regional differences have all but disappeared. The South is less distinct from other parts of the country. If you look at the map that shows the share of the Democratic vote, you'll see that the South no longer looks all that different from the rest of the country. All those conservative Democrats are now voting Republican. Liberals in the Northeast and the Midwest that used to identify as Republicans are now voting as Democrats. So today what we have are two political parties that are very competitive and evenly matched in presidential elections, but they're also ideologically worlds apart. Liberals and conservatives have simply sorted themselves into two different parties. Now, this poses real challenges for candidates for president because they have to devise a policy platform that is ideological to win in the primaries, but then attract moderates in the general election. Bill Clinton does this to great effect in 1992. In that election, to solidify his credentials as a new Democrat that is not a liberal, Bill Clinton promises to end welfare as we know it by compelling welfare recipients to work. He promises to be tough on crime and to support free trade. All policy positions that tended to be identified with Republicans. He also campaigns on a middle class tax cut, which and also signaled a moderate stance on abortion, calling for it to be safe, legal, and rare. But when he won, it wasn't because he had revived the old New Deal coalition. In 1992 and again in 1996, Clinton still fails to carry half the states in the former Confederacy. And then you can see in yellow on the map Ross Perot's third party candidacy, which attracts support across the country and probably cost Republican candidate George Bush crucial support in some close states. So that helps to elect Clinton in 1992. So even though he's a Southern Democrat, it's a very different kind of policy platform that he uses, a very different kind of base that he assembles in 1992 to win that election. In fact, today, the old regional bases of the party are less important than they were during the New Deal. Today, the party's bases are defined less by the region of the country or by states than by the split between urban and rural areas or the split between coastal areas and the heartland of the country. Population changes in states are also testing the old balances of power. Specifically, states in the West and the South, where Republicans have recently been strong, are seeing large waves of immigration, with new residents coming in from other states or even other countries, especially Latin America and Asia. So states like Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, that used to be Republican strongholds, are much more competitive these days. Suburbs and states with these large population increases, these have emerged as the swing territories where candidates have to compete by appealing to middle of the road voters. So just as Bill Clinton tried to become a new Democrat in order to try to reassemble a majority Democratic coalition, so too have Republicans have to try to rethink the old bases of power. For example, George W. Bush in 2000 made a point of trying to court Latino voters, a new part of the Republican coalition. These Latino voters make up a growing share of the electorate in Florida, Texas, California, and Arizona. And then his support for the Medicare prescription drug benefit was an attempt to win the support of elderly Americans, who are an important voting bloc in states like Florida. His championing of the No Child Left Behind Act was part of an effort to portray himself as a new kind of compassionate conservative and also win over some of the suburban moderate voters. At the same time, he's trying to do this No Child Left Behind, Medicare reform, even some of the civil rights restrictions that follow the war on terror and the war in Iraq. All of those have helped to split the Republican Party. So today what you have is the Democratic Party and the Republican Party trying to find new ways of reassembling their coalitions. And these coalitions are less defined by region than more very specific voting blocs like suburbs or Latino groups or immigrant groups. What this means is that in the present election in 2008, the candidates Barack Obama and John McCain are left in very unfamiliar territory than candidates in the past.